What I thought would be great would be to have just a couple people introduce themselves, maybe two or three people, and just share where you're from or where you're currently at, what brought you to this community, and what's your intention for being here. Because I think part of the intention for me is I want it to be, more and more you guys getting to know each other and be able to create a sense of community with each other as well too. So that feels like a valuable part of the process. So if anybody feels inspired to share first, I like to have people move preferably by their inspiration. So if anybody feels inspired to introduce themselves.
I'll go, Brian.
All right, Jeff, I love it.
Yeah. My name's Jeff. I'm from Ohio, currently in North Carolina on a work trip. But yeah, I came to know Brian through a breathwork session, and it was pretty powerful experience for me. And then it was like I was already down a spiritual path of like non-duality, just looking it up on my own, and then had this breathwork session. Never talked to Brian about it at all. Um, and there's this guy I was watching on YouTube all the time, Marshall Davis. And so I had this breathwork session with Brian. A couple days go by, and then Brian's on Marshall Davis's YouTube channel on like a interview, and yeah, so he called me to check in after my breathwork session a couple days after, and I was just like, man, this is crazy. Like all this stuff happened during the breathwork, and then you're on Marshall Davis's channel. So then we talked for a bit, and he invited me to join the men's mastermind. So I started doing that, and kind of been involved in the community since. Um, I'm here because I am waking up to the realization that developing a relationship with God is my purpose in life, and probably one of the most important things. Well, is the most important thing. So, yeah, I'm here to try to deepen a relationship with God, and that's what I that's my intention for being here. So I'm complete with that.
Thank you, Jeff. Great to have you here. Anybody else want to say hello?
I'm willing.
All right.
Yes. Hi,
Hi,
I'm
Rachel.
Rachel. I'm
Hey.
Rachel, and I'm here because I guess it started really by discovering the band Papadosio, and that's how I met Jacob and Jeff and my husband, and we've become good friends since. And my husband is in the mastermind class and thinks a lot of the group and Brian. And I guess my backstory in a nutshell, I was raised in church, a lot of church, non-denominational Christian school growing up, and didn't really wasn't really my thing until college. I did have an encounter with Jesus and was very passionate about telling everyone about Jesus and wanted to be a missionary. And I have done mission work all over the world, and have been involved in church until the last few years. It just seemed to be stale and dead, and I wasn't really growing, and I was getting I don't know, we just walked away during the pandemic. We just left, and I'm still searching. I still want to know God, but I feel like some of the things in the church just it wasn't full of life. And I saw sparks of light and life in Jeff and Jacob, and I've seen growth in my husband, and I want to grow too. So I'm here just to learn and hopefully grow. So yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. That's a perfect segue, I think, into what I feel like we're gonna talk about tonight. And what a blessing we get Avery on Wednesday nights and we get you on Thursday nights. So it's perfect. Okay, maybe one more person.
I'll go because that sounded Rachel's path sounds very similar to mine. Because I grew up in the church as well, and was very much into the church life for a while, and then kind of wandered away from it a little bit in college, and then back to it pretty much full on when I first got married, and then kind of on and off after that. And then if right around the time of the pandemic happened, or the pandemic, I didn't agree with how our church approached the whole thing, and that turned me off. And then started going to a different type of church, and that fed me for a little while. And then I started to realize that some of the things that the messaging that the church was sharing was not resonating with me any longer. Just through a lot of the doctrine and so forth, it was like God was being put in this box. This, like, like, if you don't worship this way, then you can't call yourself a Christian, type of thing. And so I just got really turned off from the messaging that was being at least the way I was perceiving it. And so I just completely walked away from the church altogether, and then have been kind of on a seeking path as well, trying to figure out how to have a relationship with God outside of the structures of a church. And so that's kind of why I'm here. And I met Brian through the Big Glow group, and then went to a retreat in Black Mountain. Was it 2 years ago, I think now? And then worked with Brian and one-on-one coaching for a while. And so I'm looking and really craving a community. And as I'm seeking a different way to be in a relationship with God. So I'm here.
Beautiful. Thanks, Bethany. Thanks for
Yeah,
sharing.
thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we could have more shares later on, but yeah, I love having a chance for people to share off the bat like that. So that was great. Thank you all for sharing authentically. Just a couple things. You can use the chat box to communicate that way. There's a digital hand. You can hit that if you'd like to say something. We'll have some in-person events coming up. One will be here, our first one here at our place, September 28th in Southwest Virginia, the Virginia Highlands, as it's called. I know some of you already told me you're planning to come, but that'll be a great place to connect in person and go deeper together and see what we're doing here and how we're living here. So I'm excited about that. I don't have a link up for that yet. Hopefully by Sunday, there'll be a link up for that to register for that, but it will be happening September 28th. So you can mark your calendars on that. You donate to support using the Eventbrite link. And I just want to say, yeah, the intention here is pretty simple. It's really, if you kind of simplify it down, we talk about a lot of stuff. Some of it's very kind of elevated and sophisticated seemingly, but it's really just about transcending suffering, and doing that within ourselves. And then the more we do it within ourselves, we are part of the collective. So the more we do that within ourselves, and the more we're offering that naturally to the world. So that's how we, as the old saying goes, we change the world by changing ourselves. So that's really the intention here, because we're a microcosm of the macrocosm. I think quite literally, the entire universe resides inside us. And so, take care of this space here, and then you emanate that out to the rest of the world. So just a quick little prayer that we are receptive and open tonight for whatever epiphanies, whatever openings, whatever transformations, whatever new ways of seeing and being arise inside us. and that we are humble and open to the moment, and that we share whatever opens up here naturally for the benefit of all beings. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I'm really excited to talk about this actually. So what I want to talk about is the levels of consciousness and relate that specifically to Christianity. And I think you can relate it to actually any religion, but being that that is the primary religion in the United States, and that's where most of us live, or all of us live that are on here right now. And that's what most of us grew up in. That's what I think we're going to focus on. So I've been rereading Dr. David Hawkins, his books. I know several of you here have been looking at his stuff as well. And there's a map of consciousness that he breaks down. You can break down the map of consciousness in a lot of different ways. This is not the only way. It's just a way, right? And it's not the truth. It's just a the map is not the territory, right? So but a map helps you to get a general sense of the territory. So I think that this breakdown is very helpful. And I think there's a couple things to understand is that, let me see if I can pull up something here to show you. Yeah. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. So
That's cool.
So a couple things to understand. I think one thing is that there are levels of consciousness. I think a lot of people don't even have any awareness of that or understand that or think about that. But these levels of consciousness, this map goes from 0 to 1,000, right? And you ascend up these levels of consciousness. So the lowest would be 0, the highest would be 1,000. According to this map, most people calibrate around, I think it was just below 200, and now it's just above 200. It's around 200. And so that's just about the level of like kind of moving, according to this map, moving from, sort of negative vibration to positive vibration, if you want to call it that. So most people are just kind of teetering on that balance. And then as you go up in the higher levels of consciousness, it's becomes rare, more and more rare, until the highest level of consciousness, there's actually, according to David Hawkins, there's as far as he knows anyway, there's no one alive who is at that level, but there have been some people like Jesus, one of the few who's been in that level of consciousness. So he's kind of like the model of that level of consciousness. And so you move through these levels of consciousness, and you move through them basically through trial and error. You move through them through the experiences you're given. You move them through the challenges you're given, and through the challenges and experiences you're given, you learn, you grow, you awaken, and you move up into higher levels of consciousness. So I think one thing that's so important to understand is like the challenges that we're given, they're not wrong. They're right. They're right for us to move into the higher levels of consciousness. Like everything we're experiencing, the difficulties, the challenges, the hardships, they're there for us to awaken, to grow, to evolve in our consciousness and move into higher levels of consciousness. So when I started like studying the David Hawkins, then I'm studying Christianity, looking at Christianity in a new way, and this light bulb goes on, which is like, oh wow, all these levels of consciousness correspond to all the levels of Christianity. And everything starts to make sense, because when people talk about Christianity, I was so confusing to me, because it's like there's so many different kinds of Christianity. There's I think it's in the billions of people now who consider themselves Christian on planet Earth, right? So there's so many different kinds of Christianity. And once you kind of look at these levels of consciousness, it starts to make sense of the different kinds of Christianity. So these levels of consciousness, they correspond with different narratives, they correspond with different worldviews, they correspond with different feelings, different triggers, different addictions. It's a whole consciousness, right? A whole way of seeing and being in the world. And so this is why you may grow up in a certain kind of church and it doesn't resonate with you now because you've went into a higher level of consciousness, right? So if you look through these levels of consciousness, you look at the lowest one of all is shame, right? So if we just focus on Christianity, there's a type of Christianity that's focused on shame, right? So that there's like shame-based Christianity, which is the lowest level of consciousness that's on this graph. And so if you vibrate, if you're in a lot of shame inside yourself, then you'll vibrate to that kind of Christianity, and if you start to kind of move out of that Christianity, then you'll elevate into higher levels. So you have these very low down guilt, shame, grief, fear, anger, just name a few of them. So there's a Christianity that is based on guilt and shame and anger and fear, and this is very low vibration Christianity. So there's something may come in you as you kind of you're in that kind of environment, and something may come in you that's like, well, this isn't exactly right. This doesn't feel true, but you don't know what else there is. So you kind of leave that, and you're trying to find something that's higher because you do feel some spiritual calling, but it's not really clear what it is, right? Now, there's another interesting thing as you kind of move through. I'm not going to go into every one of these, but as you kind of move through, there's one here which is higher, which is reason, which is at 400. So what's interesting about that to me is that's kind of like, not to say that everybody in that level is like this, but that's kind of like the scientist, like kind of like the intelligent atheist, right? So it's like the humanist, right? So there's kind of this thing of like, okay, all this like dogma based around like fear and anger and guilt and shame. This is not working for me. So I'm gonna like really get into my rational mind, get into reason, get into the intellect, and I'm gonna get into like scientism, and I'm going to understand the world like analytically, and remove myself from anything that's considered to be religious, right? So I think a lot of us go through that phase, or are going through that phase, or are about to go through that phase, and it feels to me like it's a natural phase that one can move through, where there's some disillusionment with Christianity, and that's definitely a phase that I went through, right? So, and then there's this kind of like, oh, there's nothing else, right? But then there's this kind of realization that was, I would say the realization primarily came in a direct way, kind of like prayer, meditation, epiphanies. It's just kind of because it's something that's sort of it's something that's hard to find in the human society, in the human culture as it's currently constituted. So in this direct way, you start to see these purple ones: love, joy, peace, enlightenment, these highest level of consciousness. There's kind of like this dawning of like, oh, there is this like highest form of Christianity, which was the true transmission of Christ and the true teaching of Christ. And I'm being called to that, and we're being called to that. So it's almost like we're going into this like stage 3, that's like this higher level of the true teaching and true transmission of Christ. And it's super exciting, but it's also it doesn't have the kind of like, I don't know if it ever will. It doesn't have the kind of institutionalized structures, doesn't have the bureaucratic structures, doesn't have the dogmatic structures. It's more of the mystical path, it's more of the direct relationship with God. It's a direct relationship with God, which is the universal creative intelligence, that is the loving presence that animates and creates all things, and that we're called to come into union with. And we're called to come into union with because we are in union with it, because that's our creator. So the only reason we're called to come in union with it is because it's the truth. The truth is that we are in union with that creative life force, and to me, that's what we're being called forth now, and people are hearing this calling in different ways and kind of finding their way. And it sure is helpful to have other people on the path to be exploring this with, and to be inquiring into this with, and to be moving into these highest levels of consciousness with. And the more you give yourself to this, the more you realize it becomes very clear that this is why we're here. This is our true purpose, to open up to this true essence of who we really are, and to fully be able to express this in the world. And we don't have to be like hard on ourselves. We don't have to, because I think one of the things that happens is when you aspire to something so high, you start to go back down into these lower levels of shame and guilt when you don't achieve it, when you don't hit the mark. But I think it's important to understand that, like, this is it's a paradox, because it's very hard, but it's also very easy. And I think it's hard because it's so easy. Like, it is who we really are, but the mind wants to create separation, wants to create division, wants to create problems, wants to tell us all the things that separate us from this loving presence that resides inside us and resides inside of all existence. And so it's this paradox where it's very rare to realize this truth and live it in the world, even though it's innate inside all of us. So we're being called to something that's so beautiful, and is at the heart. And there's something in us that knows it. Like, we recognize truth, we recognize beauty, we recognize the goodness. And then we start to feel all these parts of ourself that want to resist it, want to fight it, want to tell us we're not worthy of it, tell us that we're not capable of, like, we can't love ourselves in this kind of a way. All kinds of different stories come into being, and when you attract these stories, they're coming from one of these lower levels. So this is another level that gets really interesting, and this gets into some law of attraction type teachings. So something like guilt, right? Let's say there's the Christian religion of guilt, that kind of vibration of consciousness. And so you're kind of caught up in that, and shame, you're caught up in that, and then you kind of break out of it. And what's a common thing is to then have all this kind of resistance against it, and to fight it, and to, like, there's a guy that I know, very smart guy. I think he's like a psychiatrist, and I see him on Facebook, and he's fascinating to me because almost everything he posts is about how much he hates Christianity, and what he grew up with, and how terrible it is. And it's like an obsession, it's like it's mostly all he posts. And it's like, the thing that's interesting is that when you resist these levels, you're actually still caught in the level. So wanting to be in the level or not wanting to be in the level still keeps you caught in the level. So there's this process of being able to observe these levels of consciousness without resisting them, having this deep level of presence that you can observe these levels of consciousness, because we're all going to be exposed to these different levels in different ways, right? So can we be exposed to these levels of consciousness and maintain compassion of these levels of consciousness without getting in a state of resistance? Or it's super interesting. Jesus had this, going into the teachings of Jesus, one of the things I find is how deep they are, and they're hard to understand. They're hard for us to get a hold of. And the simple statement that Jesus said is, do not resist evil. And it's like, that, as a human being, your first instinct is like, what? It makes no sense. Like, it's evil. Of course you want to resist it. Why would you not resist evil? But as you go deeper into this consciousness, this is why. Because if you resist these lower levels of consciousness, then you're stuck in them, then you're caught in them. So the way to transcend them is not to resist them. And that non-resistance, non-attachment, so you're not attaching to, I want it, you're not attaching to, I'm pushing it away. you're just kind of like a cloud, like just allowing it to pass, you know, like in meditation, you're just allowing it to pass. And that's how you ascend into the higher levels of consciousness and into the recognition that who you truly are transcends feelings that come and go, transcends thoughts that come and go, transcends narratives and stories that come and go. So that's really important, is to have that awareness of not being in a state of resistance or attachment to these lower levels of consciousness. I think one more thing I want to share is just sometimes it gets confusing about like, what's the truth? You know, you hear different narratives and it's like, what's the truth, right? What's interesting is when you have these different levels of consciousness, what you realize is that all these different levels of consciousness have their own truths. Like if you're in the energy of guilt and shame, what you're experiencing is true for you, for someone who's in the energy of guilt and shame. You know, if you're in the energy of anger, what's true for you is true for someone. Those you're gonna be attached to or attracted to or magnetized to stories of anger. So when you, even stories that are not about you, but they have anger in them, you're gonna be like, yeah, that's true. I agree with that, you know. And for you, it's true, you know, and for whoever's gravitating to that, that's true. So that's your kind of whole world view, is an angry view of the world, you know. And the same thing for all these other different levels, right? But as you ascend to consciousness, then, you know, if you're in the consciousness of love, then the narratives, the stories that you'll be magnetized to, that will be attracted to you, will be stories that are grounded in love, you know. And so that feels important too, because there's, as you realize these different levels of consciousness, there's not as much of a need to kind of argue with people, because they're seeing things from the level of consciousness that they're at, and you're seeing things from the level of consciousness that you're at. You can certainly like share your perspective with people that are interested, but if people are in these other levels of consciousness and they're not interested, then they'll be in those stories until the truth is, what generally makes you evolve into out of these levels of consciousness is suffering. So as you suffer, you start to realize that this isn't working, and I want to ascend to something higher, and you keep going until you ascend to the highest levels of consciousness. So that is the journey that we are on together. Oh, I forgot to have Brandy Lynn in here. Yeah. Any questions or comments or reflections on any of that? Will's giving me the thumbs up. I believe that you've studied David Hawkins quite a bit, Will, and his levels of consciousness. You want to share any verbal reflections? Hi, Brandy Lynn, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining.
Hey, I think that they can be really a helpful tool to understanding ourselves, you know. And the way that it is, I think it's also really cool the way that he's using what seems to be a scientific type method to identify that there are objective states of enlightenment, you know, which is something that outside of religious traditions, it's been hard to recognize. But he, you know, ideally, when we were developing science, it was out of the intention to be searching for truth, you know? So it's a beautiful extension of that search for truth to identify these mystic states, and then be able to clarify the teachings of those unique, like, spiritual states of consciousness and being, to make it more digestible for all of us, you know, because the goal is really to enable the growth that chart implies. I think it's beautiful, but I loved that dissertation. I'm glad it was recorded, or I thought that was really well placed out in terms of a kind of a mirror between the Christian walk, because it's a similar walk up, and it clarifies a lot of things. There's so much wisdom to go through there. But I thought it was awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Brian.
Hey.
A quick question. So on each of those columns, so I pulled it up on my own here so I could have it for later to go over a little bit more. But
Yeah.
could you explain what each of those columns specifically means? Like it says predominant emotional state, view of life, God view and process. Like what each of those columns exactly means, so I'm understanding this better.
Sure, I'm looking at it. I'm not going to say that I know what every one of them means, because I don't. But generally, you're going into higher and higher levels of the absolute truth. You're going into higher and higher levels of the loving presence, God. The loving presence that animates all things. And so, energetic log would be, that's his scale of 0 to 1,000. So 1,000 is the absolute highest a human being could ever attain, and 0 would be the lowest. And I think one thing I should say too is I was talking about how you can send up a level of consciousness, but you can also oscillate between them. So let's say, you're kind of riding around 350 or something, and then you have some tragic event, and somebody close to you dies, or there's some breakup or something. You could go down into grief, and be in that for a year or something. Or I'm just giving a hypothetical, but it's not like it's static. It can move, and there can be a feeling of like, oh, I'm going backwards, or I'm regressing or something, and maybe there's something you need to retrieve to get you to move up higher. But the idea is ultimately we're all moving towards, the truth of who we really are. So a predominant emotional state, I think that's kind of self-explanatory. Like that's the predominant emotional state that you're in most of the time. I would say in the highest levels is pretty much, all of the time. And then view of life is kind of like your worldview. So the lowest level, it's like this world is miserable, this world is evil, this world is hopeless, this world is tragic, until the highest levels of like this world is perfect, this world is complete, I like this world is, because for a few reasons we get into, but so that's the highest level. And then God, yeah, great. So it's like God is someone who despises me. God is there's a vindictive God, a condemning God, a disdainful God, vengeful God. I think these are the kind of gods that have turned a lot of people off from Christianity, right? It's like these are the gods that like I don't like this God. And so then people will move away, and maybe they become atheists or something along these lines. And then this highest level is the direct mystical communion. So then it's like, no, actually, like the God that I'm connected to is wise. This God is loving. This God is one. This God is all being. And then the highest is self, meaning like there is absolutely no separation between you and God. That's the communion. So an important distinction there is, it doesn't mean I am God, the ego, the ego is God. That's not what it means. It's more like me, the ego, is a total illusion. So there's no more separation division because there's no more separate me. I'm just a pure vessel for God's love to transmit. And so that would be the place that Jesus was emanating from. There's no separation between God and me. I'm pure, clear channel for God. And then there's the humility. That's the crazy thing about it, is because it's like whatever kind of miracles I perform, or whatever kind of amazing feats I perform, or things I accomplish, it's like the glory goes to God, with me only as a vessel. So then the process, let's see. I think the process to me looks like it's just kind of how it shows up. a way it shows up in your life. We can look at that one closer, but I think that's how I would define that one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. I was just
Yeah.
kind of curious as to how each of those played out. And I feel like just from my own personal experience in the church that I grew up in, I felt like there was a lot of time spent on the very low end of this.
I know.
The guilt and the shame were pretty big. As I was given the message all the time, you're a sinner, you're a sinner, you're a sinner. And there was a lot of guilt and shame wrapped up in that. And then every once in a while, we would get a message where we could kind of dip our toes into the joy and love category. But the only way to get there was to confess all of your sins. You can only get to joy and love and peace if you confess all your sins and take Jesus Christ as your savior. It was just this kind of weird messaging that, that I haven't really been able to interpret for myself until, the last couple of years when I really started to look at it with a different viewpoint and been able to kind of accept, a different message around that. So yeah.
That's why I find these levels really helpful because of discernment. Because now you can start to listen and be like, oh, you're talking about Christianity that vibrates at 30. You know what I mean? I'm interested in one that vibrates at 1,000, right? So it's like you can start to make this discernment as you're like hearing what people are sharing and like how they're interpreting, these teachings of Jesus and transmission of Jesus based on the consciousness of where they're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, because I can't say how many churches I attended when I was younger that were just like, it was so solemn and just like, I mean, there is a sacredness in there, right? Like there's this beautiful sacredness in some of those solemn experiences, but at the same time, there was this lack of joy and love in those, congregations. It's just like, it just felt so dead, really. And it was like, this is not the Christianity that I experience. And it's just like, I recently at the beginning of the summer went to a service like that because I had a family member that was going through confirmation, and the whole service, it was all I could do to just make it through the service. But, I was there to support a family member. So it was just, but the difference in what I now know to be Christianity is so drastically different than what I grew up in. It's just, I don't know. I mean, people I know that are in that place of that shame and guilt type of Christianity, they're not aware. They don't know that there is a difference, that there is a better place.
Yeah.
But once you realize that, you see how just kind of stuck in that place that you really are, and that there's way more to it. So
yeah, and the further that you go up, I think this is important. Like the further you go up, the less and less people are there. So it's like that's why it's harder to like it's like there's less and less guideposts. So like most people are, I mean, it sounds, I don't know how it sounds, but it's just true. Like the higher you go, the more human beings are pulling you down and the less are pulling you up. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that, like from family members still that are still in that, lower vibration type setting. I mean, my parents, for one, I mean, they're always like, well, why aren't you going to church? And why aren't you, doing this and that? And I'm just like, because I can't, and they remain there, and they keep trying to pull me back in, and I have no interest at all.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel good anymore.
Yeah. But it's kind of like if you became like, it's very different, but just as an example, like if you were like aspiring basketball player, and like, the better player you become, there's less and less people that can coach you how to be better because you're better than almost everybody. You know what I mean? Like it's the same with like consciousness and spirituality, like, and so so that's just something to be mindful of, is like the further you go on this path, like it becomes more rare territory, and it can feel lonely sometimes. It can feel like isolated. It can feel like you're like alone. Um, and I think the people that you do find, and you will definitely, those people will come into being that you resonate with, those relationships are like even more special, you know. And God's giving you those relationships. Like God's giving you the teachers, God's giving you the books, God's giving you the YouTube videos, you know. It's there. Um, but yeah, it's, you have to kind of like listen closely and just like be more attentive to the synchronicity as it unfolds, and you know, the communities that you're, that your community that you're called into. Okay, Brandy Lynn.
What's really cool is, Bethany, as you grow in your relationship, I grew up in church. God will encourage you to look outside of the boxes, these little boxes that we as men and women try to define and push spirit and source into by way of understanding, trying to understand the all, but in turn limit to the furthest reaches of our imaginations of what creator God is and what source is. And so this is a call and just an encouragement to think outside of those structures, because the Jesus or the God that we're learning is not defined by those boxes. There might be a little sliver of truth in each and every idea and concept, but it goes beyond that, and it goes beyond this timeline and beyond this earth and this form and this vessel and this body. And you start thinking interdimensionality and what we are, our spirit being housed in this vessel, and what it is before and after, and will continue to be, and the intertwining of it can blow thy mind in all ways. And I love how Brian says that the chart oscillates. Like, you reach an enlightenment level and then you oscillate because of life and the learning and the things that God calls to your mind and spirit to grow in. And then you find yourself working on those lower levels. It's not a shock to me that it kind of imitates the chakra system, right? And how we start by those base functionalities, you know, lower, and then work our way up, and we oscillate, and that's just the growing process in this life and this body and this timeline. But we all know that there's way more to it than just this, than just this vessel, just this ability, the capability of our 10% functioning mind, you know, and all of the programming and the structures and the stuff that we manage through. So I just encourage you to continue to think outside of the box, because that's where the majority of creator is, or whatever you want to call it, source, God, Jesus, all of that, you know.
Yeah, we're talking about something that can't be talked about, you know. We're talking about something that can't be conceptualized by the mind. That's why it's called the mystical path, right? Because it's like, as you go deeper into the truth, you realize that the mind is very limited. And the mind, there's actually a good metaphor is the eyeball, right? So the eyeball actually cannot see itself. We look into mirrors, right? But the eyeball never actually sees itself, you know. So, you know, who we really are, or who God really is, we can't actually see. They talk about this in the Bible straightforward too. It's like, you can't see God. But there's some way of, that's beyond the mind. So this is what kind of Will was talking about, where like there's science that studies the material world, and there's another science that studies the spiritual world, and is able to just be interested. So just in the same way we're interested in truth in the material world, we're interested in truth in the world that's beyond the material world, you know? And yeah, this is something that transcends thought and the rational linear mind, but then it infuses the rational linear mind. You know, that's the beautiful thing about it. Who else wants to share?
I wanted to just comment on a point that was made about the levels of consciousness and getting out of, or how Christianity teaches you must not sin in order to, rise up.
Yeah.
Hawkins, he also says, like, when you ask him, what's your path, to salvation or transcendence, he says, essentially, stay out of energy fields that are under 200 or in those negative domains. Which I think is curious because a lot of people are upset with Christianity and some of their sort of like, you have to walk a certain way, but there are certain boundaries in creation in terms of, it's not like an absolute free for all. It is like God does reside at like the top, not the bottom. I mean, he's everywhere, but in terms of our understanding of him, it's not in hell, it's in heaven. So it is interesting to look at that as like a more or less objective way to, like, is there a direction that I need to consistently head in order to experience those higher energies? And he says yes, and so does Christianity, though I do think a lot of the churches are really teaching what that is, maybe incorrectly or just distorting that understanding.
Or from a lower level of consciousness.
Exactly. So it's a wonderful thing to explore. I'm so glad that we're shining light on it, and it's beautiful. It's good for all.
Thanks. Well, let's talk about sin a little bit because it is really interesting. So like sin, the way we define it is to miss the mark, right? So if the highest level is 1,000 and we're aiming for the highest level of 1,000, and we do something that's bringing us away from that highest level, then you could say that we sinned. We missed the mark. But I also think it's like not really that big of a deal. It's normal. Like anytime, if you're learning to play darts for the first time, you're going to miss the bullseye almost every time. And then as you get, over maybe, thousands of throws, you'll start to figure it out, right? So this life is a school, and we're here to make mistakes and to learn and to grow and evolve through the levels of consciousness. So that's one thing. And the second thing I think is really important is like this idea of like, I don't get this thing of like, I think these lower levels of consciousness, they have this Christianity of like, you are a sinner, which I don't relate to that or resonate with that really at all. I don't think that we are sinners. I think that we sin, and I think that's an important difference, right? Our natural state is the divine state. Our natural state is union with God. Our natural state is union with Christ, and that's all in the Bible, And so this idea that like you are a sinner, it seems like it reinforces separation and division. That's going to take you away from who you really are and what you're actually called to bring into being. So I think instead of identifying oneself as a sinner, I think it's identifying yourself with who you truly are, the divine essence of who you truly are, your unification with God and with Christ, and then you may forget who you really are, and then you may make a mistake, and you can call that sin if you want, or not call it sin if you want. But whatever you call it, the fact is you're acting in a way that is not aligned with the truth of who you are. So then that will cause negative feedback in your life, because whenever you don't live in line with the truth, then it's like a feedback loop. It's like God's telling you, hey, that's the wrong way. Hey, don't be engaging that behavior. That's taking you away from the truth of who you are. So it's not designed to like punish you or hurt you. It's designed to help you, to keep you within the proper rails of being in the highest level of the realization of who you really are, to expressing that highest level of love in the world. And it really is about love. Ultimately, this is about love. And it's a love that's unconditional and is deeper than anything that comes or goes, deeper than any emotional feeling. Brandy Lynn.
Yeah, I grew up in that kind of background. Do you know where you're going to go when you die? Is it going to be heaven or hell? Like very, very strict. However, even from a child, I had a relationship with God. Jesus was my imaginary friend from as early as I could remember. And there were things even being preached across the pulpit that I just knew. I'm like, okay, this is not God. This is not creator, because there's a message of love, and who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Neither flood, no fire, no storm. Like creator is making a specific point that there is nothing that can separate us from that source, from that all, right? However, I'm getting a different message in church. Of course, that sends people in a whole spin. Now, I know I'm learning. I don't know. I'm learning how to identify between the preaching, which is man-made, and it's constructed by limited thoughts and belief patterns and systems and sociological structures, and you've got church structures that have been designed and developed to keep people in slavery in their mind and in their body and in their heart and in their finances and in their family and in their children. And it's not until a personal relationship with Creator begins to develop that you begin to see outside of these structures and hold to the truths that have been promised to you. As a parent, I would never push my child away or send them to hell. Okay. However, I understand that there is a cause and effect. So you create an energy, an action, emotion based on the base level, and that's what you receive. And then the feelings and the experience that you get back is a reverberation of what you put out. Okay. So it's not God saying you are less than, you are a sinner. I am going to remove my face from you and never see you or talk to you again. And that creates isolation. That creates a whole bunch of issues that I'm sure we'll all get into at a later date. But I mean, this is such a wonderful thing that this is God in creation. He's putting people together of like mind to support and love one another and kind of like deconstruct the programming that's been forced on us and this timeline and this world for eons. And
I just want to say, like, to put it simply, it's like we're creating a church from these higher levels of consciousness and not the lower levels of consciousness.
That's exactly what we need to do, because that teaching that our identity is within original sin, it has some meaning, because within the body mind identity, if one believes they're a body, then they're going to be continued to attract those low vibrations. But as we affirm that your true identity is spirit, even now, as you identify as a body mind, it is still spirit that is giving you life, then it's much more of just a good teaching in my mind, in terms of why not just be what God made you to be already. It's more natural just to elevate towards that place, and to rather than to try to avoid being a sinner. I just think it's beautiful that we can shine light on that label and really, yeah, air it out. Because the truth about it is that we're trying to get to spirit, and that's really what God made us to be. And that's the one that's even thinking they're a sinner and going through all this is still an expression of that spirit right now. So redefining it as a mistake and an error, but like sin implies like a forever a purposeful and forever deviation away from God's will, which is an arrogant notion that we have the power to do so. We can, but not absolutely. We can misalign and misalign and misalign, but we can't totally change ourselves out of creation. And God's love is so much more powerful. So this teaching really resonates with me in terms of redefining what you just said, Brian, that bringing Christ's teachings from that higher perspective to, scoop up from the top rather than trying to like scrape our way up there.
Amen.
But it's really beautiful. It's really it's a God sent notion, and it's
Literally.
yes, it's right time.
It's the right time and it's the right place. We're the right people. All right, Gio, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the whole sin thing. So I've kind of had my own like personal exploration with Christianity. At one point, I was very like in the kind of like rigid sense of it, and like it was the very like dogmatic way, and I didn't feel any resonance with that. And as I grew, I started to see like, for example, they have these ideas of the seven deadly sins, right? So that's like lust, envy, greed, sloth. There's more, but basically they have these ideas, right? And when it comes to the very like dogmatic religious aspect, which is like, as you were talking about, the lower levels of consciousness, I see that there's a lot of fear. And I think during the time of when Christianity first began, and even before then, humans kind of were in like a lot of fear. Like there's like, oh, there's these neighboring tribes, they're gonna kill us, they're gonna attack us, they're gonna rape our women. It was a lot of fear, right? And so a lot of these rules were based around fear and and control, right? And so I think when you come into a higher level of consciousness, you start to see that there are reasons behind these things. Like, for example, when it comes to the idea of lust, like there are people who are addicted to pornography. There are people who are unfaithful to their spouse, or maybe they objectify women instead of seeing them as genuine human beings, right? And so there is a place for this concept of sin. There is a place for this concept of like right and wrong, but it's not in the sense of this fear that's like, if you do this, you're going to hell, and you're going to be judged, and it's like it's this objective like wrong thing. Like I don't think anyone can ever like fall away from the love of God or do something so bad as to never be redeemed again or whatever, right? I think what happens is that there's nuance in all of this, and there's a way of understanding it that's not so black and white. There's a way of understanding it that's not um oh, this is wrong, because I think you and me actually, Dad, we were having this conversation not too long ago. We were talking about when you're raising a child, you can tell them right and wrong, but if you never explain why, if you never explain why what they're doing is wrong, then they're never going to learn. They're never going to like actually correct themselves. And like that explanation of why, I think, has been missing for thousands of years. Like the church just says, okay, this is a sin, this is not a sin. But because there's no explanation of the consequences that come from those things, or why that is a thing, that it's become a very thing of like people are not allowed to be intelligent. They're not allowed to reach those higher levels of consciousness, because it's this very like, oh yeah, we need to control people. And maybe there is some truth to what they're teaching, but it's so like narrow-minded, and it's so like, oh, we just need to control people, that it doesn't give people a chance to actually develop into their own selves, and come up with their own beliefs and understand, okay, I see why these things are taught. I see why, greed is bad. I see why envy is bad. I see, and instead of these things being, oh yeah, the rich man goes to hell or whatever, like you have to go through you can't go through the eye of a needle or whatever, right? Um, I just think that a lot of these things, there's so much nuance to it, that at least from myself, like my own personal journey, I have come to understand these teachings a lot deeper, and the concept of sin, a lot of the things that the traditional morality that is in Christianity, I've come to see it like a deeper sense of it that really is about love. Because I think when people talk about love, it's not just love for others, it's also love for yourself as well. So like a lot of the things in the Bible, it talks about not only not destroying your body, because it says the body is a temple, right? So, don't be like a drunkard, or don't be somebody who's like completely controlled by your sexual desire, or be somebody who's only controlled by greed and the the lust for money or whatever, right? Like a lot of these things, it either has to do with a lack of love for yourself or a lack of love for others. And I think a lot of times it has to do with both at the same time. A lot of these rules have to do with what creates the most optimum world. Like what way can I live in my life where I'm contributing to a better world each and every moment. And I think that's the understanding that people need to come from. That's the higher consciousness understanding, is there is a way. And I think another thing too is with the rebellion part, because you were saying how people, when they try to move to higher levels of consciousness, they might fall down, or when they try to like break away from the dogma, they stay in that. And one thing I notice is that when people come out of Christianity, they start to live these like wild, crazy lives, and they think that that is the way. Like the way to live is to be extremely hedonistic, and that's the alternative to Christianity, right? And also some people say, they're an atheist and they become very hateful of Christianity. But I also think morally they become hedonists, right? And obviously that's not the answer as well. And I think the problem with that again is like, instead of thinking from a perspective of a higher consciousness perspective, where like these aren't just rules, they're actually teachings that instill love, right? Because when you have a child, right, there is some discipline there. You want them to learn the right way, and so there is some rules of like, you can't step into the street, otherwise you're going to get hit by a car, right? So there are ways, there are rules in life that people have to live by to create a better society, to live the best lives for themselves. But it's a matter of, what perspective are you looking at that from? Is it a perspective of fear? Is it a perspective of, I want to control people? Or is it a perspective of love for myself, love for my neighbor, right? And obviously the most important thing is understanding that God loves us all. And a lot of Christians have this idea that we're born into sin, and we're naturally sinners and all that stuff. And I think, obviously, to switch that around, we have a spark of divine within every one of us. And it's a matter of coming to that realization and living from that spark of divine, which is what obviously Jesus did when he was on earth, right? Jesus is the embodiment of basically having the bringing the spiritual life, and bringing God down within the human experience. And I think that's the most important thing to understand. And I think when people have that understanding, the ideas, the morals, the concept of sin is more involved. It's not this very low consciousness way of thinking.
So
Great
true.
stuff, Gio.
So good.
Yeah. I want to add
That
one
was
more
awesome.
thing about being born a sinner, or being born to sin, or whatever. There is one kind of positive angle on that, which is that there's a sense of, basically, we're not it creates humility. So like there's this great story, probably one of the all-time great stories in the Bible, where there's a woman who's about to be stoned to death for adultery, and they say, Jesus, and Jesus is there. So they say, Jesus, this woman committed adultery. Should we stone her? And Jesus is like, he's like all chill, and he's just like, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And then they all drop their stones and walk away, you know. And then
Yeah, he was probably writing all of their names on the dirt. So you want to stone her? Oh, I see you, Joseph. Yeah, when was that? Thursday? Oh yeah, I see Adam. What was that? Tuesday? So you guys want to stone her, but take a look at yourself. I always wondered what he was writing there on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. So if they didn't, if they were like, oh, I'm perfect, I never did anything wrong, then they would have. So it's like, it does create this kind of humility where you can, like, if you see somebody who's really lost and really confused, and doing some things that are not aligned with God, there's a potential to have compassion, because you know that that's inside, that potential is inside you as well. So it can create a connection point. So I think that it's powerful from that perspective, but I don't think you have to identify yourself as a sinner. It's more like seeing like, yeah, that potential is in me. You know, I'm capable of the same thing. I'm capable of the worst things of humanity. I'm capable of the best things as well. We forget that part, you know. So people will see these, you know, people. This is another big thing about Christianity, is there's a whole kind of segment of Christianity that's like, to even say like I want to become like Christ is blasphemous. They hate that, you know. But I think that's what Jesus said we're called to. He said, you will do all of this and greater, right? So that is what we're called to, and we are capable of that. So we're capable of the highest of the high, and we're capable of the lowest of the low. And that's so it's like there's a humility there, and then we just keep ourselves focused on moving towards the high, you know.
I really love about Jesus is that he made a point to go outside of the temple. So he got so frustrated within the temple that he had emotional outbursts, like on a very, very real level, like turning over coin tables, like yelling, like saying, "You've turned my house into a house of thieves and robbers." And he purposely went to the neighboring towns of Samaria, which were considered less than, like almost like a subgroup of Jerusalem, and went to the to who they considered the dirtiest whore in the village and spoke to her directly. And it made such an impact that he said, all of you religious who think that you are closer to the kingdom, it is harder for you to enter the eye of a needle than these who you are disgracing on a day-to-day basis. He went to the local lady who could not have a husband, and he sat at the well and he spoke to her so personally with love, and knew her, that not only did it change her life, but it changed that whole entire area. Jesus,
And it's changed our lives, because
yeah,
we're still retelling the story.
right? Isn't that so cool? Like, it wasn't him connecting with the synagogues and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the Roman Empire to create this big old religion. No, he stayed humble and meek, and really just loved the people, taught them how to heal themselves, taught them how to have a connection outside of the religious structures. So powerful that we are, again, still learning about it more than 2,000 years later. But that's just, you know, he ministered to the lowest, to the most broken, to the meekest, to the ragtag bunch of guys, you know, the disciples that were causing mayhem in the Jewish quarters. And you got to understand that during that time, they were in the middle of a Jewish civil war. They were a broken people that were being overcome by the Roman Empire. Like more than ever, the taxes were being raised. The synagogues, in partnership with the Roman Empire, were having people do more in sacrifices. So in their religion, there's certain kinds of animals and sacrifices that you must do to atone yourself of sin. So the message of you are a sinner, you are less than, you will never reach heaven, your family's not good enough, you're not good enough, like that is where they were. And out of that turmoil and that pressure, Jesus comes and just revolutionizes the mentality of the people at that time. Just, my favorite person.
Thanks, Freddie Lynn. Anybody else want to share any questions, comments, or reflections? what I feel called to share is just for us to be really mindful of not to just merely intellectualize this, but really feel this like a fire in the heart, you know? Because I think that's what it is. It's not a intellectual, conceptual, academic endeavor. You know, it's something that it's like it lights you up so fully, so deeply. And I think it is on the heart level. Like you can actually literally feel it in your heart. And then when it's like that's why I have the as our kind of logo, I have the circle with the fire in the middle. And then the circle's catching fire. So it's like this it lights up this fire in your heart, and then other people feel it and it lights them up. And and then and it infuses them. And so it's like it's deeper than it's like, yeah, we're using a lot of words, you know, and we're using a lot of ideas, but I just want to say that like it's deeper than words, it's deeper than ideas. It's like this transfusion of energy, this like this fire that lights up the heart. And then other people feel it and they're like, I want to be a part of that too. And then it's like a fire spreads, you know. So I feel like we're at this really auspicious time in the human story where this fire is reemerging and it's coming through us and it's spreading, you know, and you know we are the second coming of Christ. You know, it's not some guy coming down from the sky and saying hello, here I am. You know, it's like it's through our hearts, like it's exploding through our hearts, and we become the body of Christ. You know, we become the body of Christ. We become this unified field, and then um, that is felt, that is seen, that is heard, and then it grows. You know, um, people are magnetized towards it because people don't want to suffer. You know, they want to find peace, they want to find love, they want to find freedom, they want to find empowerment, and you find it by realizing the truth of who we really are and expressing it in the world. And this is the good news. This is the good news. This is the true good news. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up. I'll just give you a few announcements, ways to plug in. So I mentioned they had the retreat here, September 28th, Saturday, September 28th. Give you more info on that in the next few days. Great chance to come together in person. I do personal coaching, couples coaching, group coaching. You can reach out about that. We do have the men's mastermind on Wednesday nights. If anybody's interested, contact me about that. We'll have a conversation about that. We have a Telegram group that is active. This will be replayed on YouTube and on my podcast, which goes out on Spotify and Apple and all those good places. Have some other public events coming up. If you're not on the newsletter that I have, you can get on the newsletter, and I share the upcoming public events that are coming up on there. And I think that's it. I love this. I'm really grateful and appreciative for you guys. Like I always say, like it wouldn't be fun without you. You guys make it fun, and us coming together is what makes this a beautiful experience. So thanks for being here. Feel free to share. Oh, a couple more things. Feel free to share like themes you want to explore or questions you want to go into or things you want reflection on. Yeah, I'm more than happy to address things that people want to explore to start things off. And so feel free to share that. And then I think next week we're gonna talk, or if it's not next week, it'll be very soon. We're gonna talk about, speaking of the men's mastermind group, some of the guys will talk about like what's happening there and how these truths can come through men and how they can come through women. So the women can ask the men questions, the men can ask the women questions. We can have this kind of like interactive space of like understanding how we're being called to, you know, co-create this new paradigm together. So look forward to that. People are clapping, there's applause. That's good to see. So much love and appreciation for all of you. And see you next week.